I wanted to ask you, you mentioned power, or just like kind of rate of force. So we had Eric Lagoy on the podcast, so we talked a little bit about that too. I wanted to ask you, how do you train power for your masters athletes, and how do you kind of define that? Is it its own separate training modality, or are you just maybe more simplistic and do things like tempo and all these types of things?
Yeah, so it depends on the sport of the masters athlete, or if it's just somebody who I have flagged, for example, who has issues with reactionary control and is at risk for falls because of that. So if I have a masters athlete who's an Olympic weightlifter, I feel like the power part is easy. We're going to train specific to the sport in whatever way they're still able. You know, like a split snatch is more common in a master's level athlete than in an open level athlete in terms of their ability to still participate in that movement. So if that is the case, then I'm training specific to their sport. The same is true with track and field and endurance runners. If I'm working in a general geriatric population and I'm trying to incorporate strength, I usually take the modalities that I'm using in my strength training program and add an aspect of speed. So there's a really nice systematic review that looks at optimizing power development at different percentages of 1 rep max for different functional tasks. So we actually know, like for sit to stand, for example, that 40 to 60% of your 1 rep max is where you can optimize power and speed in an older population. So if I know what their 1 rep max is relatively, usually I use an indirect measure of estimating that, then I can take it down to 40 to 60%, do a bunch of squats or sit to stands at that percentage.
And just say stand up as fast
as quickly as you can. Yep.
Conjugate for seniors.
So, okay, funny story. I was in a gym one time, and I was traveling, so I was in this gym, and there was a personal trainer who was working with a 67-year-old woman, and that's awesome, but I made the mistake of listening to what they were doing, and my husband had to escort me out. He was doing strict press, and he was doing GVT with her, 10 by 10 strict press with a 67-year-old woman who did not have full range of motion, and he was kind of pushing into end range that she probably wasn't that ready for, especially at that volume. And he's like, you could just tell your kids that you're doing GVT training. And I was like, she doesn't care about GVT training. And I'm I could feel myself just wanting to help and intervene. And my husband's like, you need to get out of here. You're going to pop a top about that. So, but that's just a funny random story that I had about when you said conjugate method, it reminded me of that.
Sit to stand with these chains real quick.
Yeah.
German volume training for those who don't know. So go hit your 10 by 10 squats, boys and girls.
Tell me how you feel after.
The percentage for that starts relatively high too, if I remember correctly.
It's brutal. It's pretty brutal. It's
pretty rough.
But adapt or die. If you make it through, you're going to have something.
Natural selection accelerated.
So that I love that. And with your weightlifting population, and we're talking about the sport being powerful in general, so that's easy, right? You just do the sport. And your cues maybe aren't necessarily different. We cue our weightlifters to move fast. We're saying that all the time. Faster. And maybe there would be this I don't know, temptation to not use those types of terms with the masters athlete because of that frailty stigma, right? Well, just do it to your comfort level or something like that. But speed is relative to their ability also. So if you say move fast, they're only going to move as fast as they're able to move anyway. It's about intent. So if the intent of the adaptation of the quality is there, then that's hopefully what they're going to be developing. So again, it just kind of comes back to what you said. I love the point of age as a consideration. It's certainly a consideration, but it's not a limiting factor. So you just keep that in mind. We don't have to. Yeah.
We see that a lot with intensity too in the geriatric literature. So when you hear high intensity interval training, you think CrossFit or these people dying on treadmills, just sweating their brains out. But for the older population, they're still working at a high intensity. It's just relative. It's the same thing with power. You're getting people to work quickly or with speed but that speed is relative to where they are from a physiological perspective. And so I think sometimes people just get this wrong idea when they hear these words, and it's just a semantics issue where we have to realize that, like, again, high intensity, my older clients are working at a high intensity, but it's a high intensity for them. So yeah, we see that a lot.
It's kind of rehab in general. Rehab is the training principles still apply. You're just maybe at a different starting point. So if you have an experienced younger athlete and a relatively inexperienced masters athlete, things don't necessarily change the overall picture. It's just like the starting point and the progression, may be different.
Yeah, absolutely. When I'm teaching the modern management of the older adult course, which is to outpatient orthopedic therapists, but also to therapists who are working in like skilled nursing facilities, the title of the talk is treating older adults like masters athletes, because we go through the principles of strength training, and then we add in some of the layers like clinical geriatric syndromes, cardiopulmonary physiology and compromise, all those type of things. But again, it's scaling. So the person, you still have to systematically think through these things like you would as a strength coach trying to progress an older athlete, but you're just adding in the extra layer of that potential comorbidities, functional limitations, that type of thing, cognitive decline. So
well, that's really interesting. And I know we didn't have any papers for this one, but when you go to and do talks like that, do you find that you also find fear avoidance behaviors by the actual clinicians as well, as opposed to just the patients and the elderly individuals you see? Because Level Up and Steph Allen posted a paper the other day about fear avoidance beliefs in clinicians and how that spills over into our treatment programs and protocols. So do you experience that quite a bit too? Like, well, I don't want to do that with an older patient because I'm afraid I'm going to hurt them, or some clinicians have this belief of frailty that's not necessarily accurate.
Yeah, absolutely. It's actually funny. So Dustin, who I speak with, we just pulled that 2006 paper. So it was GPs. It wasn't physios, but it was GPs' perceptions and low back pain and how it can influence outcomes. Mm-hmm. But absolutely, we were just teaching a course in South Dakota, and we had a lot of clinicians, more that were working in assisted living facilities and skilled nursing facilities. And we were teaching them like a continuum to progress a squat and a deadlift in this course. And I had a couple of them come up to me and say, I haven't been doing this for 20 years because I was afraid that I would hurt my client. And you're teaching me like how to get people to pick things up off the floor. And so for me, those are my big wins when I'm teaching, because we are addressing that fear avoidance type of behavior. And it does tend to be really common. Like a good example is hip precautions after a hip replacement. So starting in 2002, we started getting literature that the hip precautions actually don't really reduce the rate of dislocation. And so the recommendation based on a systematic review that was published in 2015 was to get rid of them. And we were talking about this at the course. And I even know that when I am flexing somebody who's early post hip replacement past 90, that I can feel it, like, because in school, it was like, you do not flex past 90. You do not rotate that hip. You do not cross your legs. Like, you do not bend over to pick something up. Like, I have been so ingrained with that. And I looked at the literature. I've read the studies and everything like that. And some of the surgeons have said, don't worry about it. But I can still feel that drive to be conservative and watch what I'm doing, even though I know the literature. So it's a really good example of, that's probably that would have limited my ability to progress them at a rate that would be appropriate for them, because I was trying to be conservative. And is that really helping my client? So we see it a lot.